under influence of the American history of criminology, it became very much a part of sociology. But in other countries, like in France, it's very much linked to political science, to demographics, to sociology, to anthropology. So yeah, I think it has also an influence on how you deal with these topics. And of course, again, there are advantages and disadvantages to the two systems, as I have known both and was forced to introduce the 4-year program. I would say the advantages of the 4-year program is that you can really offer this multidisciplinary approach to crime phenomena and social reactions to crime from all the basic disciplines. So you have courses in law, sociology, psychology, history, philosophy of sciences. You have several courses on purely criminological theories, who of course will be sociological or psychological and so on, environmental. I think our students have a very good knowledge of how the criminal justice system works, of all the legal frameworks of the criminal justice system. They have a lot of methodology, so they are familiar with both quantitative and qualitative methodologies, although I will come back to that. So they know the different languages that are used in the different disciplines that deal with those phenomena. They know the different concepts. And with our former boss, Chris Eliaerts, I once wrote an article in a Belgian book on what is criminology. And we concluded that because of this, criminologists can act as a sort of interpreter, a translator between the different disciplines or between the different professional actors, because they are usually the ones who know sufficient from all those disciplines to know what people mean when they use a certain concept or refer to a certain theory. And because of this quite unique overview they have, we see that quite a few of our students end up in quite hierarchical positions within police departments or within the criminal justice departments. They are asked to devise policies because they have this overview of the complexity of the phenomena. The disadvantage, I would say, is a bit like, you could compare it to a general practitioner in medicine. They have this holistic approach. They know enough from all these disciplines, but they don't have the specialized expertise that lawyers or sociologists or political scientists or anthropologists will have, or historians will have. So sometimes they lack this in-depth expertise that the others have. Usually they have not the same high-level methodological skills, especially quantitative skills that sociologists or psychologists will have. And one of the big disadvantages also, I think, is that it has become almost impossible to combine criminology with another full degree. So we lost a whole generation of lawyer criminologists and sociology criminologists and psychological criminologists who all spoke the same language, even if they came from another basic discipline. So we have tried in our university to remedy this by introducing what we call a minor in criminology. So law students now can take a minor in criminology as a kind of specialization in the last year of their law school. So they get several courses in criminology, and then they can still do criminology in 1 year. But they have to take this minor. So in fact, it's still 2 years, you could say. So we have tried to introduce this also in sociology department, in psychology, but it means that those degrees have to be open to this kind of interest. And it doesn't always fit with their expertise, with the topics that they are dealing with, even if it's obvious that we do have a lot in common. So sometimes we have been successful, sometimes a bit less to introduce these minors in criminology. But on the other hand, we see that a lot of lawyers, sociologists, psychologists take courses in criminology again, because they can take an optional course. And there we see, for example, penology and prison law has 3 times more students now than a couple of years ago, and many of them come from these other departments. So I would say that's the advantages and disadvantages of the 4-year program. The 2-year program, as I said, especially if they already have a master degree, then they each bring their own disciplinary and methodological background. They are experts in their basic discipline. And it's very interesting to work together then, because if they have then added criminology, we still speak the same language, even if we come from a different background. If they haven't done any criminology, then it's more difficult because we may use the same concept and not have the same definition of the concept. But the disadvantages, I think, is that, you don't, in 2 years' time, you don't really have time to go into criminological theories. You don't have time to go in a lot of methodology. So if you come there as a lawyer, you have never had any methodology in social scientific research. If you're a sociologist or a psychologist, you probably have no knowledge at all of the legal frameworks or the criminal justice system. For example, when I started my PhD, I did research based on judicial and prison files. I had never had any course on methodology. So I had to study descriptive statistics on my own in order to do my PhD. Yeah. So when Chris Elias and I had to develop this 4-year program, we took a lot of several methodological and statistical courses for the students because we thought they really need this to be able to do research, but also for people who do not intend to go into academia, but will go into police departments or in the criminal justice department. And I said very often they come into quite high positions. They will be asked to devise policies or to evaluate policies. So they will also need these methodologies to read about research or even to develop their own research in those capacities. So I think, the different systems have advantages and disadvantages, but we didn't really have a choice. So we had to live with it.
But from a practical point of view, if you've been delivering 4-year programs for more than 30 years and it is still successful, it means that people find jobs when they get their diplomas.
Yes, and there's also a systematic follow-up done by the different universities to see how our students end up in the labor market.
So there is this link. Wait, we should get someone from that institute too, because it's a nice story.
Yeah. But the criminologists who are working there are all, again, university-trained criminologists coming from one of the 6 institutes. If they get a PhD, it will be at one of the 6 university institutes. So there are quite close cooperations also in certain research projects with this national institute.
And there is something also that you mentioned lightly and that you and Lieven are well aware of, but for our listeners that maybe do not know the history of the universities in Belgium, this division between the division of the Université Libre de Bruxelles in 2 and Leuven also in 2. I know it's a difficult topic, but someone must talk about it once, no?
It's a Belgian joke, Well, in fact, the oldest university in Belgium is, of course, Leuven, which started as a Catholic university. And that was for a long time the only university. And then when Belgium did not exist yet, but was still with the Netherlands, it was decided that there should be a state university that was independent from church, as the Catholic university was very much linked to the church. So 2 universities were created in Ghent and in Liège to have state universities. But then in 1834, the Free University of Brussels was established to be independent both from the church and the state. And because that was, of course, you already had the Catholic university and you had the state university, so the Université Libre de Bruxelles was established by free thinking. In fact, the at the origin also Freemasons. Still the idea that everybody at the VUB and ULB are Freemasons, which is not true, but we are certainly free thinkers. And so the idea was that Belgium lacked this kind of independent scientific institute that could not be influenced neither by church, neither by the state. But then in the 1960s, especially in 1968, with the student revolt, there were a lot of movements, of course, as in many European countries, which then led to splitting both in Leuven and in Brussels, the universities in two independent universities, because the Dutch-speaking university in Leuven and in Brussels was part of the bigger French-speaking university. So there was this whole struggle for independence from the Dutch-speaking parts, who felt that they were often dealt with as a minority. You know, Dutch was not a scientific language, and so it was regarded as maybe less important than the French-speaking and so on. So there was this whole struggle, in fact, by the students from Leuven and Brussels together. So the Catholics and the free-thinking students struggled together against the French-speaking dominance to create their own Dutch-speaking, Dutch language university. So that's why we have those 6 main universities in Belgium, and then you have other universities that were created later on in different areas of Belgium, more regional. But that's why I would say you have the 2 state ones and the 2 free ones, which are the Catholic one and the free thinking one. But of course, the whole regulation is more or less the same. We have to submit to the same criteria of quality assessments, research assessments, education assessments, and so on. So, but for example, the free universities do not have, I would say, representatives of the political structure in their board of administration, which I think the state universities have. And we will not have people from Catholic. Regarding the introduction of the First Prison Act, the whole reform of the parole system in Belgium, and so on. When the Dutroux case exploded in Parliament, they wanted to abolish parole for serious offenders, and she was very important, together with all of us who were giving her scientific evidence on why parole is a better protection of society than not having parole. And I think that's why the minister succeeded in saving parole, even if it became much more strict and severe and so on. So she was able to give those scientific arguments because we were, all working on that. And of course, I myself, for example, have been a member of 2 drafting committees. So we drafted the 2 main acts for the prisons in Belgium at the moment, the Prison Act of 2005 and the Act on external legal position, parole, electronic monitoring, and so on of 2006. So of course, you do that as an expert. I was asked to be a member of that drafting committee as an academic expert, but also because of my expertise in the Council of Europe. I was for many years an expert with the CPT, European Committee for Prevention of Torture. So I was asked to bring in the standards of the CPT and of the European Court and so on into that committee. So you still keep your function as an expert and you bring it in what you hope then will become the legislation. And of course, once it goes to Parliament, all kind of things happen with your beautiful drafted legislation. But I mean, that's part of the game. You agree to enter into this political game, and then you know what the consequences will be, and it can be very frustrating, it can be very rewarding. But again, I think that's a very personal decision to make, whether you should do it or not. But I think several criminologists in Belgium have had an influence on penal policies because of this direct involvement, either as members of the cabinets of ministers or through these drafting of legislation and so on.
And these are very concrete examples that you gave us. So these are
Yeah.
perfect because sometimes it's not so easy. And when you see the legislations of some countries, instead of improving, there are more crimes that are included. The length of the sentences is longer. So in your case, you had specific,
yes,
very good examples.
That can also happen. For example, with the last Minister of Justice, Crystal Bayens, my colleague, and I wrote a quite critical article in a political journal on the new policy plan of the Minister of Justice, and he asked us for a discussion about it. And he seemed to agree with what we were saying. And then 2 weeks later, longer sentences for sex offenders were introduced. So, but at the same time now he went to Finland and he says, well, we should more look like, having penal policies and prison policies as they do in the Scandinavian countries. And that is also something that we suggested. So, of course, a politician has to take into account other pressures than academics, and there is a public opinion and so on. So it can be frustrating, but at least I was glad he went to Finland and not to the United States like one of our former ministers of justice.
Yeah, but it's interesting this because I am a little bit puzzled. Well, now with the effect of the pandemic on imprisonment rates, this may change. But if you compare, for example, Belgium to the Netherlands were going down in the number of inmates. In Belgium, it was not the case, and I couldn't find clear explanations of that. The Netherlands was closing prisons, and in Belgium there were new partnerships, private-public partnerships for new prisons. Do you have an idea of what happened?
You mean during the pandemic? No, before the pandemic.
No, I mean before, because the pandemic changed the trend, and we don't. It's still too early to see what would happen.
Well, when you talk about the Netherlands, of course, you know that the Netherlands had even lower prison rates before that. They started having 17 detention rate on 100,000 in the 1970s and 80s. So then suddenly they were increasing. So what we saw the last years was in fact a decrease from the increase that came before.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This after after the economic, the financial crisis, and contrary to all expectations, instead of rising, according to let's say Marxist explanations, they started to go down in many places, but not necessarily in Belgium. I was surprised in the 2010s that you could not see this trend, and it was not easy for me to explain. Maybe it's the length of the sentences.
Yeah, well, Crystal Bayens and I devised a schematic overview of all the different factors that influence detention rates. So it takes about 3 hours to explain.
Okay. No, I know. So I thought that maybe there was something that escaped me.
No. But what we do see in Belgium is that over the years, the prison population has changed. And that where traditional groups who used to be in prison because of the prison overcrowding were released earlier or other sanctions were applied, we have this phenomenon of foreign nationals without legal permit who are now a huge percentage both of remand prisoners and sentence prisoners. And the research that we have done at our university shows that that is mainly because they don't have a legal permit of residence. So they are put under remand for offenses that people with a legal permit or Belgians would never be put for in prison because they don't have a permit. And so they're seen as escape risk, they're seen as recidivist risk. And so we have a huge overrepresentation of that profile now in our prisons. And the same is true for the prison sentence, because you can't give electronic monitoring if they don't have a legal residence, and the same is for releasing them, because although it was not meant to be, the parole system is apparently also applied in a quite strict way to people with this profile. So, of course, we know that criminal policy and penal policy and prison policies have a very great influence on how the prison population looks like and the numbers. But what we know is that Belgium, in general, has much longer prison sentences than the Netherlands. And again, I was asked in Parliament to discuss this new penal code that is being drafted. And I gave the Commission of Justice an overview. Even in the new penal code, when you compare the Netherlands, Finland, Norway, and the new penal code for Belgium, we're still stricter. And we're still having longer sentences than those countries. So, of course, if you have longer sentences, it's much more difficult also, for example, during a pandemic, to go for a stop on the input or to have early releases. It's much easier if these are smaller, short sentences. So it's a very complex.
Yeah, but you clear. I knew you would find at least two factors that play a major role. I know you a little bit over the years.
Yeah.
So those were. I mean, these are two major issues there. Also discussing in the podcast with Henrik Tam and with Huberto, but he told me that outside of the podcast that they were surprised by how the typical profile. I know there is not only one profile of a prisoner, but the typical profile had changed over their years. I mean, they were in the late 60s in Canada at the both were at the Institut de Criminology. So they were there in the years of where there was a lot of movement in Europe, and both said it used to be a guy from a poor class who committed theft, a national from a lower class who committed theft. Something similar happened also probably in Belgium?
Yes, I think there are several movements. Of course, we had an increase in the community sanctions, and what you see now is that I think indeed for a small theft without violence and a person who is a Belgian national or has a legal permit of residence, if it's a first time, he would get a suspended sentence or maybe a fine if it's really not very important. So the prison sentence would be only in case of recidivism for a second or a third time. However, again, I already referred to the Dutroux case, but for example, the Dutroux case had a huge impact on the whole criminal justice system with regard to how sex offenders are dealt with. So the legislation was made more strict with higher sentences. Police became more aware of the situation of victims of sex offenses. So the whole police attitude changed toward the victims with much more openness to receiving their complaints and so on. Prosecution became much more strict for everything relating to sex offenders. The sentences were much longer. Remand custody became almost automatic from the moment there is a sex offense, and parole was made much more difficult and much stricter. So the percentage of sex offenders hugely increased proportionately in our prison populations because those are the people that were focused on in a much more strict way. And for the first time, we also had people aged 70, 75 who were sentenced to prison for the first time because of child abuse or other sex offenses that in the previous years would not have received the same attention. So yes, obviously there is a change. We also have, of course, again, depending on the region, we have a huge emphasis on the drug trafficking near Antwerp, because that's, of course, the international harbor. And we see plenty of young people working in the harbor in Antwerp, 19, 20, 22 years old, getting involved in drug trafficking because they get, I know, 10,000 euros to get some coke in a car, and then they all get 8 to 10 years imprisonment.
Yeah.
So again, the criminal policy and the penal policy is a huge factor in the profile you get in your prisons, of course.
There are two very important things that you mentioned there. One, one is, how punishment changes over the years. So in the 70s, a local guy who committed theft without violence for the first time would go to prison. And now, at the same time as we are saying, we have become more punitive and punitive populism, and we talk about that, these cases are no longer going to prison. And this contradiction, the ones that go for longer, but the others, maybe they do not go. So it's so difficult to make sense of all this and give a coherent speech, which you managed to do, of course.
Well, that's the famous bifurcation policy, of course. But of course, the sensibilities in society have also changed. There was recently a publication on research done in the Flanders part of Belgium on how the public thinks about seriousness of crime. And again, you see it internationally, it's very much the same results in many countries. And you see that the top of seriousness is everything that is linked to physical and sexual integrity. And everything that is linked to property crime is much below in how people perceive those crimes, which was not the case in the 1970s. We didn't talk about violence in the family. We didn't talk about rape in the marriage. So the public sensitivities have changed, legislation has changed. And I think when you look at public opinion research also in Belgium, when you talk about simple theft, people don't mind if that is electronic monitoring or even better, a work penalty, so community service, let them do something back. That's good, it's better than prison, because in prison they just watch TV and do nothing. But if it's about sex offenders or violent crimes, then prison remains the normal reaction. And also for recidivists, I think the prison remains, if you don't learn from the other sanctions, then you should go to prison as well.
And this also created a contradiction, for example, for abolitionists, because the discourse in the 70s was reduced decriminalization, and now with all this criminalization of all these kinds of violences, I don't see a lot of people there from the people from the 70s, maybe perhaps because they are already retired, but I don't see nobody. Of course, it's very politically incorrect to say something about these penalties that are imposed in the kind of cases we're talking, but I don't see a critique of why you impose a different sentence according to the gender of the person. This could be a discussion, no? But it's so thin ice.
That's still what we are doing, I think, in our research.
Thank you for following Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast.
A podcast hosted by Marcelo Aebi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium.
We aim to draw a map of the state of criminology across Europe through the words of contemporary criminologists. How is criminology defined and taught? Which are the main lines of research? Which are the main schools of thought in each country? These and many other questions are answered here by fellow researchers who share their vision on the development of criminology in their countries from its beginnings to the second decade of the 21st century. If you want to know and compare their stories, stay tuned. This podcast is edited by Eduardo Coco from the University of Lausanne. Our theme song is Seagull's Night, Noche de Gaviotas, composed by Gustavo Cantero, arranged by Tato Germano, and played by Tato and Gustavo with the voices of Sasha Conte and Alejandro Turco Guyot. Cheers, and see you soon.